In the summer of 1944, with the world still engulfed in war, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a secluded hotel in New Hampshire. They weren't there to draw battle lines or negotiate peace. They were there to design the future of money. The global economy was in ruins, shattered by depression and conflict. Currencies were worthless, and trade was paralyzed. Their solution? A new financial system called the Bretton Woods Agreement, promising stability, prosperity, and an end to the economic chaos that had fueled 2 world wars. But behind this grand vision was a quiet, calculated power play. A system designed not for equality, but to make one nation the world's banker, setting the stage for the very crises it was meant to prevent. To understand why Bretton Woods was necessary, we have to go back to the 1930s. The Great Depression had torn the world apart. In a desperate scramble for survival, countries abandoned the gold standard, devalued their currencies, and threw up trade barriers. It was economic nationalism at its worst. As World War II drew to a close, the Allied powers knew they couldn't let this happen again. They needed a coordinated system to rebuild Europe and revive global trade. The United States, now the world's undisputed industrial and financial giant, took the lead. President Roosevelt's administration envisioned a world where the US dollar, anchored to gold, would be the foundation of global commerce. But Britain, led by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, had a different idea. Keynes proposed a neutral global currency, the Bancor, managed by an international body. But America wasn't interested in neutrality. They wanted control. When the delegates arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel for the conference, the outcome was practically a foregone conclusion. The U.S. held 2/3 of the world's gold, its factories were humming, and its military was dominant. Keynes argued passionately for a fairer, multilateral system, but the American representative, Harry Dexter White, held all the cards. He insisted that the dollar would be the world's new anchor, convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. Every other currency would then be pegged to the dollar. On paper, it was a gold exchange standard. In reality, it was a dollar standard, a new global hierarchy with the United States firmly at the top. The plan was elegant. The world would have fixed exchange rates, preventing the currency wars of the past. 2 new institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, would act as guardians of this new order. The IMF would lend to countries in financial trouble, and the World Bank would fund post-war reconstruction. It all sounded like a new era of global cooperation. But beneath the surface, a hard geopolitical reality was taking shape. The Bretton Woods system locked the world into a U.S.-dominated financial order. From now on, every nation's economic health would depend on holding enough U.S. dollars, and every one of those dollars was, in theory, backed by American gold. For a while, the system worked like a dream. Europe rebuilt, global trade exploded, and the dollar became the undisputed king of currencies. Central banks around the globe stockpiled dollars. Oil, wheat, and steel were all priced in dollars. It seemed like a golden age of stability and growth. But there was a hidden catch, a fatal flaw that almost no one saw at the time. For the system to work, the world needed a steady supply of dollars. This meant the United States had to run a constant deficit, sending dollars overseas through foreign aid, investments, and massive military spending. In other words, global stability depended on the U.S. exporting its own debt. This quiet river of debt would become the true foundation of the post-war world. This inherent contradiction was later named the Triffin dilemma. If the U.S. stopped running deficits, the world economy would grind to a halt for lack of dollars. But if it kept running deficits, the flood of dollars would eventually overwhelm its gold reserves, shattering confidence in the whole system. It was a monetary catch-22. The very thing that sustained the system guaranteed its eventual collapse. Throughout the 1950s, the imbalance grew worse. The Cold War fueled a surge in American military spending, and dollars poured into Europe and Asia. Foreign central banks collected these dollars, and under the rules, they could exchange them for U.S. gold at any time. The problem was, the supply of dollars was exploding, while the U.S. gold pile remained the same. By the 1960s, the math simply didn't add up anymore. There were far more dollars out in the world than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them. The system was running on fumes and faith. The first major leader to call out this illusion was French President Charles de Gaulle. In 1965, he famously declared that the world was living under a dollar dictatorship. He questioned America as an exorbitant privilege of simply printing the world's money while other nations had to earn it through hard work. De Gaulle put his money where his mouth was. He began demanding that France's dollar reserves be converted into physical gold, shipping tons of bullion from New York back to Paris. Other countries started to get nervous and followed suit. Suddenly, the U.S. gold stock began to plummet, and the dollar's credibility started to crack. Washington scrambled to stop the bleeding, but the writing was on the wall. The golden anchor was coming loose. By the late 1960s, America was trapped. The Vietnam War and ambitious domestic spending programs were draining the treasury. The U.S. simply couldn't afford to fight a war, build a great society at home, and maintain the dollar's gold backing all at the same time. Something had to give. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon dropped a bombshell on the world. In a televised address, he announced he was closing the gold window, unilaterally ending the dollar's convertibility to gold. In an instant, the Bretton Woods system was dead. The world's currencies were no longer anchored to anything and were left to float freely. The promise of stable money had vanished overnight. Logically, a currency with no backing should have collapsed. But the dollar didn't. It evolved. America's immense geopolitical power ensured the dollar remained dominant. The U.S. struck a series of deals, most famously with Saudi Arabia, to ensure that all oil would be priced and sold exclusively in dollars. This created the Petrodollar system. Suddenly, every country needed dollars not to get gold, but to buy energy. To get those dollars, they had to sell their goods to the U.S. or buy American debt. In effect, the world continued to finance America's deficits, just without the promise of gold. The fundamental deception of Bretton Woods, building stability on a foundation of imbalance, simply continued in a new, more abstract form. Meanwhile, the IMF and World Bank, born at Bretton Woods, took on new, more controversial roles. The IMF, once a stabilizer of exchange rates, became the world's financial firefighter. When developing countries faced crises, the IMF offered loans, but with harsh conditions: austerity, privatization, and deregulation. Critics called it a new form of financial colonialism. Power no longer came from armies, but from debt and interest rates. The dream of international cooperation had morphed into a system of dependency. Today's global economy is still haunted by the ghost of Bretton Woods. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. The IMF and World Bank continue to wield immense influence. And the Triffin dilemma is more alive than ever. The world needs dollar liquidity, which means the U.S. must run huge deficits, which in turn erodes long-term confidence in the dollar itself. So, was Bretton Woods a noble failure or a brilliant deception? It delivered a generation of growth, but it did so by creating an illusion. The illusion that a single nation's currency could serve as the world's permanent anchor. It tied global finance to the political and economic decisions made in Washington, creating an empire of credit built on confidence. The collapse of Bretton Woods wasn't an accident, it was an inevitability. No currency can be both a national tool and a global standard forever. The promise of sound money backed by gold was fundamentally incompatible with a world hungry for credit. So the system broke, and what replaced it is arguably even more fragile, a floating debt-driven world where confidence is everything. In that sense, Bretton Woods never really ended. It just shed its golden skin. The machine of dependency, powered by debt and maintained by faith, continues to run. And as global debt reaches unimaginable heights, the question of what comes next becomes more urgent than ever. History teaches us that every system built on an illusion eventually collides with reality, and that reckoning is never gentle. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through monetary history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the systems that shape our world.